Have you ever stood before a building that shouldn't exist? Not because it defied architectural logic or municipal codes, but because its very presence seemed to mock the natural order of things. I have, and I pray to whatever mercy remains in this world that you never will. My name is Thomas Hartley, and in the autumn of 1838, I inherited what I believed would be my salvation, a position as county surveyor in Ashland County, Ohio. The job came through my late uncle, a man I'd met only twice in my life, who'd held the position before succumbing to what the locals called brain fever. I should have questioned why a healthy man of 43 years would suddenly develop such an ailment. I should have questioned many things, but I was young, desperate, and fleeing debts in Philadelphia that threatened to see me in prison or worse. The journey to Ashland County took me through landscapes that grew increasingly desolate the further I traveled from civilization. The forests here were different from those back east, older somehow despite the region being newly settled. The trees grew too close together, their branches intertwining overhead like clasped fingers, blocking out the sun even at midday. The locals I encountered at way stations spoke little, and when they learned of my destination, they spoke even less. It was on my third day in the county, while reviewing my uncle's incomplete surveys, that I first heard of the Winfield farmhouse. The mention came from Mrs. Elmira Crane, the boarding house proprietor where I'd taken residence. She was a severe woman of perhaps 60 years, with gray hair pulled so tightly into a bun that it stretched the corners of her eyes. "You'll want to complete the Eastern Quadrant surveys before winter," she said, setting down a plate of gray meat and boiled potatoes that would become my standard fare. "Though I'd advise you to skip the Winfield property altogether." I looked up from the maps spread across the dining table. "The Winfield property? I don't see any such name in my uncle's records." She paused in her retreat to the kitchen, her back still turned to me. "No, I suppose you wouldn't. Your uncle was smart enough not to put it to paper. The Winfield place. It's been abandoned these past 3 years. Ever since the family disappeared." Disappeared. She turned then, and I saw something in her face I couldn't quite name. Not fear exactly, but a kind of careful wariness, like someone handling glass they know is already cracked. "The house is still there, if you're fool enough to go looking. About 7 miles east, where the old Indian Trail meets Carpenter's Creek. But Mr. Hartley, some properties aren't meant to be surveyed. Some things are better left unmeasured." I should have heeded her warning. God knows I should have. But I was young and educated, filled with the arrogance that comes from university learning and the desperate need to prove myself worthy of my position. What could possibly be so troubling about an abandoned farmhouse? That night, I studied my uncle's maps more carefully. The eastern quadrant showed a peculiar gap, a rough circle perhaps 2 miles in diameter where no surveys had been completed. All around it, my uncle's meticulous measurements and notes continued as normal. But this area remained blank, like a hole punched through the paper. And at its center, barely visible in pencil so light it might have been accidental, someone had drawn a small square and written a single word, "Grows." I found more references in my uncle's personal effects, which had been delivered to my room in a small trunk. Among the standard surveying equipment and ledgers, I discovered a journal, its leather binding water-stained and warped. Most entries were routine measurements, boundary disputes, notes about soil quality. But scattered throughout were strange observations that seemed to have nothing to do with surveying. October 3rd, the Winfield house measured 24 feet in height today. This cannot be correct. Remeasured 3 times. October 17th, 26 feet. I am not going mad. The structure is taller. October 30th, 28 feet, 3 inches. God help me, I watched it happen. Just after sunset, I heard the sound, like bones breaking in reverse, knitting themselves together. The house stretched upward by precisely 3 inches while I stood there with my theodolite. November 15th, they say Josiah Winfield built it in 1822. But Indians say the foundation was already there, has always been there. They won't go near it. Smart. November 20th, Marie Winfield visited my office today. Begged me not to return to survey their property. Her eyes? There's something wrong with her eyes. They reflect light like a cat's, but only when she speaks of the house. The final entry was dated 3 days before my uncle's death. It knows I've been measuring it. I can feel it watching me, even here in town. Growing. Always growing. Reaching for something. God help whoever inherits this position. Burn this journal. Burn it all. But he hadn't burned it. Perhaps the brain fever had taken him too quickly. Or perhaps, like me, he'd been unable to let go of the mystery. That night, as rain began pattering against my window, I made my decision. Come morning, I would ride out to the Winfield property and put an end to these superstitious nonsense once and for all. The morning came shrouded in a mist so thick it seemed to swallow sound itself. My horse, a sturdy mare I'd purchased upon arrival, grew increasingly agitated as we followed the old Indian trail eastward. She whinnied and pulled against the reins, forcing me to dismount and lead her on foot for the final mile. Even then, she trembled beneath my hand, her eyes rolling white in their sockets. The forest here was wrong. I say this as a man of science, trained in observation and measurement. The trees grew in patterns that hurt to perceive, spirals that seemed to twist inward on themselves, creating optical illusions that made my eyes water. Some trunks grew perfectly straight for 20 feet, then bent at precise right angles before continuing upward. Others had bark that appeared to flow like water when I wasn't looking directly at it. I found the remains of the Carpenter's Creek Bridge, though remains suggests more structure than what actually existed. The wooden planks had not rotted. They had been pulled apart, each board twisted into impossible shapes like wooden pretzels, then carefully arranged in patterns that resembled letters in no alphabet I recognized. I had to lead my increasingly terrified mare through the shallow water, her hooves slipping on the creek bed's strangely smooth stones. It was then, as we climbed the far bank, that I first saw the Winfield farmhouse. My uncle's measurements had been wrong, not because he'd made errors, but because he'd been measuring something that refused to remain constant. The structure that rose before me through the mist defied every principle of architecture I'd studied. It was indeed a farmhouse, or had been once. The foundation and first floor maintained the traditional appearance of Ohio frontier construction. Hewn logs, chinking, small windows with real glass, a luxury in these parts. But above that, the house stretched upward like a finger pointing accusingly at heaven. I counted 7 distinct floors, each slightly narrower than the one below, creating a terraced effect. But these weren't proper floors. They were stretches of the original structure, as if someone had grabbed the roof and pulled, elongating the walls like taffy. Windows that should have been rectangular were now tall slits. Doors opened onto nothing, suspended 30 feet in the air. And the chimney. The chimney rose and rose until it disappeared into the low-hanging clouds, still releasing a thin stream of smoke. Smoke. The house was abandoned, yet smoke rose from its chimney. I tied my mare to a tree. She would go no closer, and approached with my surveying equipment. As I walked, I noticed the ground around the house was bare of grass in a perfect circle exactly 33 feet from the foundation. The soil here was black and oily, and when I knelt to examine it, I found it was warm to the touch. Not hot, but warm like a living thing, pulsing with some internal heat. The front door stood open, not ajar, but perfectly open, as if in invitation. Inside, I could see furniture, normal furniture, arranged as any farmhouse might be. A spinning wheel in the corner, a rocking chair by the hearth, a table set for dinner with 4 places, the food still steaming on the plates. I entered. God help me, I entered. The smell hit me first, not decay, but something worse. The scent of time itself gone wrong, like copper and ozone and something sweet that made my teeth ache. The steaming food on the table was impossible. Corn that grew kernels within kernels in infinite recession, bread that was simultaneously fresh and moldy, meat that still twitched despite being cooked through. But it was the height of the ceiling that truly disturbed me. From outside, I'd counted 7 stretched floors. From inside, looking up, the ceiling rose impossibly high, disappearing into darkness my lantern couldn't penetrate. And suspended throughout that vast vertical space, hung from barely visible ropes or wires, were hundreds of objects. Furniture, tools, clothing, toys, all hanging at different heights, rotating slowly as if stirred by unfelt currents. I set up my theodolite with trembling hands and began to measure. The ground floor was exactly 16 feet square. A perfect square, too perfect for frontier construction. The walls rose straight and true, but as I tracked them upward, my measurements became confused. The same wall measured 40 feet, then 43, then 39, changing each time I checked. It was as if the house was breathing, expanding and contracting in rhythms too slow for the eye to detect but fast enough to frustrate measurement. A sound from above made me freeze, footsteps, slow and deliberate, crossing the floor of what should have been the second story. But when I looked up, I could see through gaps in the stretched flooring that no one was there. The footsteps continued, now on the third floor, then the fourth, ascending steadily. I heard a door open somewhere high above, and a voice, thin and distant, called down. "Surveyor, why do you measure what grows beyond measure?" I fled. There's no shame in admitting it. I grabbed my equipment and ran, leaving my theodolite behind in my haste. But as I reached the door, I turned back for one moment and saw something that still visits me in nightmares. The hanging objects throughout that impossible vertical space had all stopped rotating. Every single one, chair, pot, child's doll, scythe, had turned to face me, oriented toward me with the deliberate attention of watching eyes. Behind me, as I ran through the woods, I heard the house groaning. The sound my uncle had described, like bones breaking in reverse. Growing. Still growing. I returned to town in a state that Mrs. Crane later described as touched. My mare had broken free of her tether and found her own way back, arriving hours before me. Foam dried on her flanks and her eyes still wild. I stumbled into the boarding house near midnight, my clothes torn by branches, my hands bleeding from falls I didn't remember taking. For 3 days, I confined myself to my room, telling Mrs. Crane I'd contracted a mild fever. But I wasn't ill, I was researching. My uncle's journal was just the beginning. I sent requests to the county records office, the church, the newspaper. I spoke to anyone who would tolerate my increasingly desperate questions. Piece by piece, I assembled the history of the Winfield family and their impossible house. Josiah Winfield had arrived in Ashland County in 1822, though from where, no one could say. He came with a wife, Marie, and 2 children, a boy named Samuel, aged 7, and a girl named Constance, aged 5. They were not farmers by trade. Josiah claimed to be a surveyor himself, though no one ever saw him practice the profession. He purchased the land where the house now stood from the government for a sum that seemed too small even for that undeveloped territory. The locals said Josiah didn't build the house so much as uncover it. He'd been seen digging at the site for weeks before any construction began, excavating something from beneath the earth. The Indians who still passed through the area warned him that the ground there was sick, that things buried by the old ones should remain buried. But Josiah continued his excavation until he'd exposed a foundation of black stone covered in the same symbols I'd seen at the ruined bridge. The house he built atop this foundation was unremarkable at first, a simple 2-story structure. But within a year, neighbors began to notice oddities. The house appeared taller each time they passed, though no one ever saw construction taking place. The Winfield children were spotted playing in upper windows that shouldn't exist, windows that weren't there the day before. I found an account from 1824 in the church records, written by Reverend Matthias Crane, presumably some relation to my landlady. He'd been called to the Winfield house to bless their new infant, a child born despite no one in town knowing Marie had been pregnant. The Reverend wrote, "The Winfield house troubles my Christian soul. Upon entering, I felt a presence not of God nor the devil, but something older and more indifferent to our human concerns. The infant they presented for blessing was perfect in form but wrong in essence. It watched me with eyes too knowing for a creature mere weeks old. And the house itself, I swear before the Lord that I climbed stairs to reach the nursery that led me higher than the structure appeared from outside." Mrs. Winfield laughed when I expressed confusion, saying, "The house grows to accommodate our needs, Reverend. Is that not God's own providence?" I performed the blessing, though the words felt hollow in that space. As I left, young Samuel Winfield, now 9 years of age, tugged at my coat and whispered, "We're not the first family to live here, Reverend. The others are still here too, just higher up. We hear them at night, walking on floors that haven't been reached yet. I shall not return to that house." The Winfields became increasingly isolated as the years passed. By 1830, the house had grown so tall that it could be seen from miles away, a dark finger scratching at the sky. The family was rarely spotted in town, and when they were, people noticed changes. Marie's eyes had developed that reflective quality my uncle noted. Josiah's fingers had grown longer, with too many joints. The children moved wrong, their gaits too fluid, as if they had forgotten the proper way humans were supposed to walk. Then there was the matter of the additional children. By 1835, census records showed the Winfields had 7 children, despite no one witnessing Marie pregnant or giving birth after that first mysterious infant. These new children were never seen in town, only glimpsed in the ever-multiplying windows of the house. I discovered a daguerreotype from 1836, taken by a traveling photographer who'd been hired to document Ohio's architectural oddities for an Eastern publication. The image showed the Winfield house as it stood 2 years before my arrival, a grotesque needle of wood and stone rising at least 60 feet into the air. But it was the figures standing in front of it that made my blood run cold. The Winfield family was arranged in a traditional pose, but there were too many of them. I counted 13 figures, all claiming to be immediate family. And their proportions were wrong, arms too long, necks extended, some of them impossibly tall while others seemed compressed. But worst of all were the faces in the windows behind them. Dozens of faces, pressed against the glass of windows that dotted the house's impossible height. Faces that looked exactly like the family standing below, as if the same people existed simultaneously in multiple places. The photographer's notes, which I obtained from his widow, contained only one comment about the Winfield sitting. They paid in gold coins bearing no mint mark I recognized. When I developed the plate, I found images that weren't there when I took the photograph. I will not return to Ohio. My investigation led me to the one living person who had spent significant time inside the Winfield house, a woman named Eleanor Marsh who had worked as a governess for the family in 1837, the year before their disappearance. She now resided in the county asylum, committed by her family after she'd been found wandering the woods, speaking in languages that didn't exist. The asylum was a grim brick building on the outskirts of town, and it took considerable persuasion and a small bribe to gain access to Mrs. Marsh. I found her in a small room with barred windows, sitting in a chair and staring at the corner where the walls met the ceiling. She was younger than I'd expected, perhaps 30, but her hair had gone completely white. "Mrs. Marsh," I began gently, "I'm Thomas Hartley, the new county surveyor. I wanted to ask you about your time with the Winfield family." Her eyes didn't move from the corner. "Are you here to measure?" That's what he did too. Josiah. Always measuring. The height, the width, the depth. But you can't measure something that exists in more dimensions than we can perceive. "What do you mean?" She finally looked at me, and I saw that her pupils were not round but rectangular, like a goat's. "The house isn't growing, Mr. Hartley. It's unfolding, like a flower blooming in directions we don't have names for. The foundation Josiah found, it was an anchor point holding something vast in place. Something that had been compressed, folded in on itself by the old ones who knew better than to let it spread." She stood and moved to the window, her movements too smooth, as if she had too many joints beneath her dress. I taught the children, or what I thought were children. Samuel and Constance were real enough at first, though changed by their proximity to the house. But the others came from upstairs, from floors that shouldn't exist. They looked like children, acted like children, but when you taught them to read, they already knew the words. They were learning to pretend not to know. "Where did these other children come from?" She laughed, a sound like glass breaking in reverse. "From the previous families. The house has always been there, Mr. Hartley, just folded up so small we couldn't see it. The Indians knew. They built the mounds to hold it down, to keep it compressed. But Josiah dug it up, and with each measurement, each survey, each attempt to define it by our limited understanding, he gave it permission to unfold further. The families don't disappear, they ascend. When the house grows tall enough, when it reaches whatever height it's seeking, the family is pulled upward into floors that exist outside our normal space. They're still there, still living, just elsewhere. I've seen them through the windows, the Josiah from 1822 and the Josiah from 1722 and the Josiah from 1622, all the way back to when the house first tried to unfold. That's impossible. The area wasn't even settled in 1622. She turned to me with a pitying smile. Settled by whom? By people like us. The house was here before the Indians, before the mound builders, before anyone you'd recognize as human. It's been trying to grow for millennia, and sometimes it succeeds for a while before someone finds a way to compress it again. What happened to the current Winfields? The ones you worked for? Her face went pale. They held out longer than most. Marie was strong. She fought the house's influence even as it changed her body. But the children were born there, you see. They belonged to the house more than to their parents. One night, I heard them singing, all 7 of the impossible children, singing in harmony with voices that came from above and below simultaneously. The song was about reaching the proper height, about finally touching what waited above. The next morning, the family was gone, but I could see them in the windows of the highest floors, floors that hurt to perceive. They waved at me, beckoned me to join them. Josiah was measuring still, using tools that weren't quite real, mapping dimensions that don't exist in our world. I ran, and I've been running ever since, even sitting still in this room. She grabbed my arm suddenly, her grip impossibly strong. Don't go back there, Mr. Hartley. Each measurement makes it stronger. Each survey gives it more reality in our world. Let it be forgotten. Let it fold back in on itself. But even as she warned me, I knew I would return. The house had shown me something that my rational mind couldn't accept but couldn't dismiss. That night, back in my room, I found my surveying notes had changed. Numbers I hadn't written appeared in my own handwriting, measurements of spaces that couldn't exist. And at the bottom of the page, in script that seemed to writhe as I read it, "Come back, measure us properly, help us reach the sky." I fought against returning for another week. I threw myself into surveying other properties, mundane farms with sensible dimensions and corners that met at proper angles. But each night, my dreams were invaded by visions of the house, growing ever taller, piercing through cloud layers into spaces between stars. In these dreams, I climbed stairs that went up and down simultaneously, measured walls that existed in multiple places at once, and always, I heard the Winfield family calling from rooms above and below. On the 8th night, I woke to find myself fully dressed and standing at my door, surveying equipment in hand. My feet had blistered. I had been sleepwalking toward the house, only waking when Mrs. Crane shook me violently in the boarding house entrance. "It's calling you, isn't it?" she said, her face grave. "Just like it called your uncle. Just like it called my husband 20 years ago." Your husband. Matthias Crane wasn't just the Reverend Mr. Hartley. He was also the county surveyor before your uncle. He became obsessed with that damned house, said it was a puzzle that needed solving, a mathematical proof of God's infinite architecture. The last time I saw him, he was heading east with his instruments, muttering numbers that couldn't possibly relate to any earthly measurement. They found his equipment at the house's threshold, but never him. Though sometimes, she paused, choosing her words carefully. Sometimes I think I see him in the upper windows when I pass that way, still measuring, still trying to understand. That revelation should have strengthened my resolve to stay away. Instead, it filled me with a terrible certainty. I was not choosing to return to the house. I had been chosen by it, selected like my uncle and Reverend Crane before me. We were surveyors, measurers, beings who tried to contain the infinite within numbers and lines. And the house needed us for something. I returned on October 31st, 1838, as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. This time, I came prepared with multiple lanterns, ropes, and most importantly, a new theodolite with modifications I'd made based on the strange mathematics that had appeared in my notes. If the house existed in dimensions beyond our normal 3, then perhaps it could be measured using principles that acknowledged those dimensions. The house had grown since my last visit. It now rose at least 90 feet into the air, its peak lost in low-hanging clouds that seemed to swirl around it in patterns that resembled the symbols on its foundation. The smoke from its chimney no longer rose. It fell upward, if such a thing makes sense, disappearing into spaces that shouldn't exist above the clouds. The front door stood open again, but this time light spilled from within. Not the warm light of candles or hearth fire, but a cold, pale illumination that seemed to come from the walls themselves. I entered, my modified theodolite clutched like a talisman. The ground floor had changed. The furniture remained, but it had been arranged in a perfect spiral, each piece positioned according to some mathematical principle I almost recognized. The table still bore its impossible meal, but now I saw that the food was moving, evolving. The corn kernels were sprouting and dying and sprouting again in accelerated cycles, the bread aging and refreshing itself, the meat decomposing and reconstituting in patterns that followed the same spiral as the furniture. I set up my theodolite and began to measure, using the equations that had invaded my dreams. And for the first time, the measurements made sense. The house wasn't just tall. It was deep, extending into dimensions that our language had no words for. What appeared as height from our limited perspective was actually growth in directions that folded back on themselves, creating spaces that were simultaneously infinite and contained. As I measured, I became aware that I was not alone. Figures moved in the peripheral of my vision, the Winfields, all of them, from every era the house had existed. They didn't walk so much as exist in multiple positions simultaneously, their movements leaving trails of themselves like multiple exposures on a photographic plate. Young Samuel Winfield stood beside me, or at least one version of him did, watching my measurements with eyes that had seen too much. "You're beginning to understand," he said, his voice coming from above and below at once. "The house isn't growing. We are. Every family that lives here, every surveyor who measures us, becomes part of the expansion. You're helping us unfold, Mr. Hartley, helping us reach the place where architecture meets anatomy." "What are you?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "We're what happens when humans try to contain the infinite within walls and measurements." The foundation Josiah found wasn't holding something down, it was an invitation, a test. Those who try to measure the unmeasurable become part of it. "Look up, Mr. Hartley. Look up and see where your measurements lead." I looked up through my theodolite, following the vertical lines of the house into that impossible space above. What I saw there changed me fundamentally, broke something in my mind that could never be repaired. The house didn't have a top, it had an anatomy. The stretched floors and elongated walls were not architecture but biology, a vast organism that existed primarily in dimensions we couldn't perceive, only anchored to our reality at the foundation point. The families weren't gone. They were digested, absorbed into the house's expanding structure. Their consciousness spread across multiple dimensional planes. I saw them all through my modified instrument, hundreds of families stretching back through time, all still alive in a sense, all still aware, all part of the house's slow unfurling into spaces between spaces. Josiah Winfield materialized beside me. Not walked, not appeared, but materialized as if he had always been there and I was just now able to perceive him. His body had been stretched like the house itself, his torso elongated, his arms reaching impossible lengths. But it was his face that haunted me most. It bore an expression of perfect mathematical ecstasy, the look of someone who had finally solved an equation that had plagued them their entire life. "Every measurement adds a dimension," he said, his voice harmonizing with itself across multiple octaves. "Every survey extends our reach. We needed surveyors, you see, measurers, those who could define space in numbers and angles. Because defining space creates space, and we need so much more space to unfold completely." "Into what?" I managed to ask. "What are you unfolding into?" "Our true form," Marie Winfield answered, descending from a ceiling that wasn't there. Her body moved like liquid architecture, flowing between states of matter. Humans think in such limited dimensions, up, down, left, right, forward, back. But there are so many more directions to grow. The house shows us these directions. It teaches us to exist in all of them simultaneously. The children began to appear, not just the 7 impossible ones, but dozens, hundreds, each one a potential child that could have existed, might exist, would exist once the house finished its expansion. They sang in harmonies that used notes between notes, creating music that existed in the spaces between sound and silence. "Join us, Mr. Hartley," they sang in unison. "Your uncle is here. Reverend Crane is here. All the surveyors who tried to measure us are here, adding their dimensions to our growth. You've already begun the transformation. Look at your hands." I looked down and screamed. My fingers had begun to elongate, developing extra joints that bent in directions that shouldn't exist. Through my modified theodolite, I could see my body from angles that were impossible, from inside myself, from outside space, from the perspective of the 4th, 5th, 6th dimensions. I was unfolding too, my limited 3-dimensional form beginning to express itself in ways that human architecture couldn't contain. "No!" I dropped the theodolite and ran for the door, but the house fought me. The floor became soft, trying to absorb my feet. The walls reached for me with protrusions that looked like arms but were actually folded spaces given form. The staircase that shouldn't exist descended from above, trying to carry me upward even as I fled downward. But I had one advantage the others hadn't possessed. I had come prepared to destroy my work. In my pocket, I carried phosphorus matches and a vial of accelerant I'd mixed myself. If I couldn't escape the house's influence, I could at least destroy the measurements that gave it power in our dimension. I pulled out my uncle's journal, my own notes, every piece of paper that contained measurements of the house, and piled them in the center of that spiral of furniture. The Winfield screamed, not with their mouths, but with their entire beings, a sound that existed in multiple dimensions at once. "You can't unmeasure us," Josiah cried, his form becoming more abstract, more architectural. "We exist now. We've been defined." "Then I'll undefine you," I said, and lit the match. The fire didn't burn the way fire should. It consumed not just the papers but the measurements themselves, the very concept of the house's dimensions. As each number turned to ash, I felt the house shudder and contract, its impossible height beginning to fold back in on itself like a telescope collapsing. The Winfield screams intensified, but they weren't screams of pain. They were screams of compression, of beings that had learned to exist in infinite space being forced back into finite forms. I watched in horror as Josiah's elongated body began to contract, his extra joints folding inward, his stretched features snapping back like rubber bands. But the process wasn't clean. Parts of him remained extended while others compressed, creating a writhing mass of flesh and architecture that was neither human nor house. The children were the worst. As the house collapsed, they aged and reverse-aged simultaneously, their forms cycling through every possible stage of development. Some became old, ancient, their skin like bark, their eyes like windows. Others became younger than infants, younger than embryos, becoming potential rather than actual, existing as possibilities that flickered in and out of reality. Marie Winfield reached for me with arms that were simultaneously too long and too short, existing in multiple states at once. "You don't understand what you're doing," she cried, her voice fracturing across dimensions. "The house isn't a prison. It's a chrysalis. We were becoming something greater, something that could perceive and exist across all dimensions. You're condemning us to singular existence." But I continued to feed the fire, burning every measurement, every survey, every record of the house's impossible dimensions. With each destroyed document, another floor collapsed, not falling, but folding into spaces that couldn't be perceived. The house was returning to its compressed state, the state the ancient builders had forced it into with their mounds and symbols. As I burned the last page, my final measurements from that very day, something extraordinary happened. The house didn't disappear. Instead, it compressed into what it had always truly been. A perfectly normal 2-story farmhouse, no different from any other frontier dwelling. The Winfield stood before me, looking dazed but human, completely ordinarily human. Samuel was a boy of 7 again, Constance a girl of 5. The impossible children were gone, never having existed in this compressed reality. What happened?" Marie asked, looking at her normal human hands. I had the strangest dream. We all did. About growing and reaching and becoming something else. I didn't answer. Couldn't. Because I understood now what the house truly was. A flaw in reality. A place where the infinite tried to express itself in finite space. And measurement, the human compulsion to define and contain and understand, was what allowed it to unfold. Every surveyor who tried to measure it gave it more reality, more dimension, more space to grow into. I stumbled from the house as the sun set, leaving the confused but restored Winfield family behind. But as I reached the tree line, I turned back one last time and saw something that haunts me still. In the upper windows of what was now a perfectly normal two-story house, I glimpsed faces, my uncle's, Reverend Crane's, and others I didn't recognize. The surveyors were still trapped, existing in dimensions that had been compressed but not eliminated, folded into spaces too small to perceive but too real to deny. That was 3 months ago. I resigned my position as county surveyor the next day, claiming health concerns. I've moved east, as far from Ohio as I can manage, but distance provides no comfort. Because I know the truth now, the house is still there, waiting. The Winfields still live in it, having forgotten their time as architectural entities, going about their lives as normal frontier farmers. But the house remembers. And worse, it's not unique. I've been researching, you see, finding patterns in architectural anomalies throughout history. Towers that grew too tall before mysteriously collapsing. Castles with rooms that couldn't exist. Pyramids with internal dimensions that exceeded their external measurements. They're all the same phenomenon, reality trying to unfold into more dimensions than we can perceive, using human measurement and observation as the catalyst. Every surveyor, every architect, every soul who tries to measure and contain space risks giving these anomalies the power to grow. We think we're defining space, but we're actually creating it, adding dimensions with every measurement, every blueprint, every map. Last week, I received a letter forwarded from Ohio. It was from the new county surveyor, a young man fresh from university, full of the same ambition I'd once possessed. He wrote to ask about the gap in the Eastern Quadrant surveys, about a certain farmhouse near Carpenter's Creek that wasn't on any of his maps. He'd heard stories, he said, curious stories about a house that had once grown taller every year. He planned to survey it properly, he wrote, to complete the records, to measure what had been left unmeasured. I wrote back immediately, urgently, begging him not to go near the place. But I know it's too late. The house has already begun calling to him, as it called to me, as it called to all who came before. Even now, I can feel it pulling at my consciousness, showing me visions of what could be if we just let it unfold completely. Sometimes, in my dreams, I'm back in that impossible vertical space, climbing stairs that lead up and down simultaneously. The Winfields are there, all versions of them, teaching me to see in directions that don't have names. And at the very top or bottom or center, it's all the same in that place. Sits the truth of what we're all becoming. Not individuals but architecture. Living, breathing, thinking architecture that exists across all possible dimensions at once. I've started drawing blueprints in my sleep. Plans for buildings that can't exist, with rooms that open onto themselves, hallways that are longer inside than outside, basements that rise above attics. My landlord found them and asked if I was an architect. I burned them all, but more appear each night, drawn in my own hand while I sleep. The house is patient. It knows that someone will eventually measure it again. Someone will survey its property, define its dimensions, give it the power to grow. And when it does, when it finally unfolds into its true form, we'll all become part of it. Every human who has ever measured space, drawn a map, or built a structure will be pulled into its expanding reality. I leave this account as a warning, though I know it will do no good. The compulsion to measure, to define, to contain the infinite within numbers and lines, it's too strong in our species. We can't help ourselves. We see mystery and we must solve it, see space and we must measure it, see the undefined and we must give it shape. The Winfield farmhouse is still there, in Ashland County, Ohio, 7 miles east of town where the old Indian Trail meets Carpenter's Creek. It looks normal now, harmless, just a 2-story farmhouse with a family living quiet, ordinary lives. But if you go there, if you measure it, if you try to survey its dimensions, you'll give it what it needs to grow again. And this time, I fear, there will be no stopping it. This time, it will unfold completely, and we'll all learn what it means to exist in dimensions beyond our comprehension. Don't go looking for it. Don't try to find it. And whatever you do, never, ever measure it. But you will, won't you? Just like I did. Just like we all do. Because that's what humans do. We measure. We define. We contain. And some things should never be contained, because they're waiting for us to try. Waiting for us to give them the dimensions they need to unfold into our reality and make us part of their architecture. The house is still growing, you see. Not in height, not anymore. It's growing in the only dimension that matters now. Probability. Every person who reads this account, every soul who hears this tale, adds to its potential. We're all measuring it now, defining it with our thoughts, our fears, our fascination. I can feel it even now, reaching through these words, through this account, folding space between writer and reader, between then and now, between what was and what will be. My fingers are beginning to stretch again as I write these final words. My body is remembering what it felt like to exist in multiple dimensions at once. The house has found another way to grow, through story, through telling, through the very act of warning against it. And now that you've read this, now that you know you're part of its architecture too, you'll dream of it tonight. A farmhouse that grows taller every year, reaching for something beyond the sky. You'll wonder if it's real. You'll research Ashland County, Ohio. You'll look for records of the Winfield family. Some of you will even go looking for it. And when you find it, because you will find it, it wants to be found, you'll discover that it's been waiting for you. That every measurement I burned has been slowly reconstituting itself in the collective unconscious of everyone who's heard this tale. That the house doesn't need physical surveyors anymore. It has us, all of us, measuring it with our minds, defining it with our fears, giving it dimension through our obsession. The Winfield farmhouse grew taller every year, yes, but that was only the beginning. Now it grows in every direction, through every dimension, through every mind that knows its story. And it will keep growing until we all live inside it, transformed into something that exists beyond the narrow confines of human architecture, human consciousness, human reality. Welcome to the house that grows. Welcome to the expansion. Welcome home.